My name is McNab Laurie. I'm team leader of the Galloway Glens scheme. If you haven't heard about the Galloway Glens scheme yet, then well, we're only here for a couple more months, to be honest, so don't bust yourself on that. But we've been doing a whole range of projects up and down the valley. Put some money into the hall here, and we put some money into the Duxbury Planetarium and a few other things up the valley. So we've done a series of online events. And one project we really haven't talked about at all is the work we've been doing with Dr. John Burns. And I'm so excited that he's going to be talking to us tonight about language, dialect, words, vocabulary, voices. And there's a lot of a sort of complexity there. John asked me to say a bit of a funny story to get you started. He didn't ask me, but I'm going to give a bit of a funny story to get started. Someone I know started working at the barony, and they said, if there's any notes, we'll leave it in your ducat. There'll be notes in your ducat. And she said, oh, I've never heard that word before. What does that mean? And they were like, oh, that's just your ducat. It's as simple as that. And she said, how do I spell that? And the lady said, well, if I was writing it down, I'd write pigeonhole, to be honest. So, and I think in microcosm there, you have the complexity of the subject that John's going to be talking about tonight. That's the funny story over John, by the way. But I like it because it sometimes, wow, there's some audio in the room there. Sometimes, if you look directly at language, you can overlook the complexity and the changing nature of it. So it's quite exciting that John's going to talk to us tonight. We've got questions at the end, so if you've got any questions at home, do please pop them into the chat box, and then seamlessly my charming assistant will help me control questions, and any questions in the room will be welcomed. We have some slides, but primarily this is really from the heart, isn't it, John, more than anything else? So yeah. So without further ado, could you please give a round of applause to our main speaker, which is John tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Nice to see so many of you here. We've had one or two call-offs because it's a very hot night and there was probably beer to be drunk or something. So thank you very much for turning up. And I'd like to start just by thanking the people that I interviewed for this. And they gave me a lot of time, and they just blathered and chatted for far too long, really. They should have got rid of me quicker. But it was a delight to do it. And the first person I interviewed was a lady at Ringford, Agnes McQueen, who's since died. So I'd just like to dedicate this to Agnes because, you know, she was a special lady. So I've got all this written down, and I'll wander off and on as we go. Like a lot of folk in the Stewartry, I grew up in a Scots-speaking home. And that's basically my language till I went to school. And then, you know what schools are like, they start changing you. So I had to learn to speak this other language, which I've mastered reasonably, although Scots is my basic language. I realised when you went to school you had to, well, we had a book, you had textbooks in those days. We had a book called The King's English. So instead of talking like this, I had to learn to speak the King's English as well as I could. And that was every day. And that was okay, I could do that. Lots of my classmates found it harder. I could switch quite happily, particularly in writing. It wasn't quite so easy when you're talking. I learned not to use words like we or hame or dich. The ones the weather forecast folk like to use nowadays. And then back at school, when I was wee, I was in a classroom that looked out onto the local hill, Ben Gairn. Sorry, I'm waving at the Zoom folk here. The teacher asked us if we knew the name of that hill. Well, I knew it was called Ben Gairn. And I knew that I helped my dad working in the garden, and I knew that the garden was the same as the garden, but the garden was posher, so please miss Ben Garden. Scathing laughter from my colleagues in the class, and it was a total embarrassment because in trying to sound correct, as I took it, I made a complete fool of myself. And that sort of thing happens all the time. It's like you and your ducat. It's such a common experience if you're a Scots speaker. And we have this kind of cultural cringe about it. We don't like to be caught out. We don't like to be caught saying we or him or these words when we're talking in a place like this. Basically, if you spoke to the minister, the teacher, the doctor, you had to talk proper. Never mastered that. Schools seem to have kept that going, because when you went to school, you're allowed to speak Scots sometimes, like 20th of January, moving up to Burns night, and then you got to recite your poem. That was great. Next day, oh, didn't say that. Don't say that. You're not allowed to say that. And half the teachers would be saying didn't, and some would be saying don't. And it was very confusing, and it's basically where we are a lot of the time now. It's difficult to work out when to use which. The education system has changed a bit, and there's more encouragement now for children to speak in Scots, to read Scots, to learn Scots songs, poems and stuff. The government has put a lot of effort into that, and I think that's just a really good thing. One of the things you have to keep in mind, Scots isn't a bad English. It's not slang, it's a completely linked but different language. We have one of the world's great literatures, and we've had that for several hundred years. It's not just a case of pronouncing a few words differently. There's a whole different sound system, a whole different grammar, and we have to learn to accept that. We have to have confidence in that. One of the daft things that happened, you know, the Scottish Enlightenment. You're all sitting. Everybody knows the Scottish Enlightenment, when most of the great philosophers, historians, economists, and people were in Scotland. They were feared to write things down without having them checked. You can go online and you'll get David Hume's document, which is setting out the Scotticisms that you have to take out of your writing. It doesn't bear thinking about. That lack of confidence among, world-leading philosophers is just crazy. So we have to get back to a situation where we accept, we develop, we use the language. One of the things that strikes me as really weird, we're quite happy to buy a mug, a tea towel. I had a mug on my teacher's desk that said Crabbit. My children bought it for me. My own children, not the ones I taught. We're quite happy with that. But then we get embarrassed about slipping a Scots word into a conversation, or if you're interviewed for some reason on television and you'll slip in a couple of Scots words, and folk get embarrassed about it. Shouldn't, just, it's your language, use it. One of the things that people pointed out to me, in a wee while we'll show you the questionnaire a lot of you will have seen, that had various words on to say whether you knew them or didn't know them or used them. And one of the things that came back from that were lots of wee comments. So as well as filling them in, and filling them in was quite entertaining, because some folk had done it on their own, so you got a very clean idea of what that person thought. Date of birth, you knew what age they were. Other folk did it with about 14 folk all filling them in the same time. So you hadn't really a clear idea of what was happening. One of the things they pointed out, 2 or 3 people put a wee note on that said, oh, I didn't realise that was the word until I heard somebody read it out. The word fly seemed to have caused a lot of trouble and various other ones. Until they heard it, they didn't realise that was the word. Oh, that's what it is. Now, you've had that experience in English. You've come across a word you've never seen before, and then somebody reads it out. Oh, that's what that word is. It's quite common experience. As an English teacher, it's quite a strange experience, because you'll be reading a book to a class, and then suddenly you'll think, I've never said that word out loud before. It's really weird when that happens. That's your job. And then suddenly you're caught out with these kind of things. So we need to remember that we don't see Scots written down a lot, unless you read poetry, unless you read plays. There's very little Scottish prose. There is some, but not an awful lot. So folk are not used to seeing it, and that causes problems as well in the status of the language. Because one of the basic things is that we think we're taught in school, in my day, that English, the King's English. We're now back to the King's English. Shows you how old the books were in my school. We're now back to the King's English, and that's better than what you lot taught. And that's a really dangerous thing for people to think about their own language. If you're taught your own language isn't worth anything, that's a terrible lesson. So we're trying to reclaim it in lots of different ways. So we've got this questionnaire, which, this is the one that you would have seen, and a lot of you will have filled it in, for which thank you very much. This caused a lot of interest, and it got out before it was, it escaped before it was supposed to get out. These are all words that I use, not every day, but these are common words in my vocabulary, personally. And there's only 2 of them that I wouldn't use regularly. No, maybe 3. And the 2 that I would pick out are through bin, down here, which is a big long stone that you put through a dike to help tie the dike together. And unless you work with stones or work on a farm, you're unlikely to know that. And unless you go out and look at dikes and wonder at their marvellousness, you're not really going to use it either. So through bin was one, and the other one was gan buddy. When I was a wee boy, there were lots of gan buddies about here. You would get essentially tramps, in the old sense, wandering the roads, sleeping in hay sheds, sometimes doing a wee bit of work, sometimes just wandering. They've gone, we don't see them now. So that word has kind of disappeared from use. The idea of the questionnaire was to get folk to say, do I know that word? Do I not know that word? Do I use that word? And one person, it's actually Agnes McQueen, said to me, well, I ken all the words, but I didn't use them. I said, well, how no? I said, well, if I'm not in the firm, I didn't have to talk about through bins and other farm words. And it just reminded me that the important thing about language is context. You know, lots of folk know lots of these words, but you never do. I haven't used the word sourdook for a long time. You know what a sourdook is? It's a wee leafy thing you pick up when you're lying about in the grass, you pick it up and chew it, and it helps your thirst a wee bit. We boys learn these things. Well, we did in the Ronnies anyway, that was just wasn't that. That's what we did for entertainment. It'll have a fancy name, but we just called them sourdooks. And you do come across it. Tumshay, what's a tumshay? A turnip. And there's a huge debate about what's a turnip and what's a mangle and what's a swede and all. I was at a poetry reading on Friday in Edinburgh, and the poet used the word tumshay, he used the word straveg, and another one I can't remember, all within 3 lines. So it was just a common thing. But some of those words are disappearing, which is something we should think a bit about. See if we can bring some of them back or keep using them. Are you aware of the Lost Words project, which is, I don't know who started it. Robert McFarlane, the nature writer, wildlife writer, wilderness writer, has done a lot of work on this because several people noticed that in new dictionaries in England, certain words weren't being included. Guess what they were? Words like acorn, kingfisher, and bluebell. a whole host of other words just coming out of the dictionary, a lot of other words being put in, most of them computer words or Love Island words and all that kind of stuff. So, so far we have fallen. So this is kind of similar. It struck me the other day that we need to remember these words. More of us than the odd weatherman can come up with a weather word to describe something. And a lot of these you would, some of them, that word gloaming, many of you would use the word gloaming. Many of you know the song Roman and the Gloaming, right? Bob Dylan sings a song in 1962 with the word gloaming in it, quite happily as an American. And it's an American song, it's not a Scottish song, but he's quite happy to use that. So these words float around and end up in different places. The other thing we have to remember is that we move around as well. You know, you go away for work, you go away for education, you've got family abroad. So there's all these influences. One person I interviewed, as soon as I'd switched the tape off and I was getting, oh, when I was in Malaya, I did, what? He'd been in the army in Malaya. Didn't think that was worth mentioning at any point. But he'd picked up things on his travels. So although we're Galloway, Glens, we're in the Glen Kens, we're in the Kirkcudbright, people have a vast hinterland of language that goes behind them and supports them. I've now lost my place. So, the other thing about the questionnaire that I heard back from people, when I started this, it was just before the pandemic hit. So I was just getting ready to get out there and record people, and then that closed it down for quite a long time before it was safe to go back and interview people that were a wee bit older. No looking at you, Andy Campbell. It just kind of stopped it, and then we had to start again gradually and get used to getting into people's houses, and we kind of forget that a wee bit. But one of the things that people said, when we did this, I did it, my dad did it, my sister did it, my sister in Canada did it, somebody in Edinburgh, I mean, so it's well away from the Galloway Glens, but it's almost impossible to just restrict it to this wee slice of the landscape. And that was a good way of connecting people, and it was connecting people intergenerationally, which I think is important. So young folk were picking up words. Oh, my granny used to say that. And once you start discussing some of them, then you'll look at other bits and recognise what's going on. And it just led to quite a bit of debate. And I think at a time when folk were isolated, sometimes folk were doing this on Zoom, sometimes on FaceTime. You know, people staying on their own were connecting with families through that and discussing this. So I think that was a valuable aspect of it, although it's not something that's not going to be celebrated anywhere, really. So what this shows, that's the words at the bottom that were in the questionnaire. There's a colour-coded idea of people born in a certain decade, as they'd filled in the sheet and said, we know this word, we don't know this word. So we could hopefully track it. This is percentages. So you get a rough idea of which of these words are still there and have gone. So if we go on to the, right. These are words that, from that list, basically these are still in very common use. Sorry, hold on, I'm standing in front of you. These are very, very common words that are, most of you would know, most of you would use. Cope, knock something over. My dad always talked about taking stuff to the cope. He would never talk about the rubbish dump. Occasionally he would say dump. It wasn't the garbage, it was, I'm going to cope. So it's tipping something up as well as what we've now got to call the Council Recycling Centre when we look it up online. Oxter for armpit is just very common. Glaicate, few teachers in the room. So, Dreich, as I say, the weather forecasters seem to be in love with the word Dreich. They've learned it somewhere in weather forecasting school. Thank you, my lovely assistant here. Clart, to cover something, generally with mud or some kind of sloshy, liquidy, guttery stuff. And blether, obviously, is just very, very common. So if we move on to the next slide, this is a surprise because I don't know which one's going to come up here. Right. These are words that have basically, well, people said these had gone. Now, some of these are like peewit for a lapwing. There's a reason for that. Lapwings have disappeared. You don't get peewits around here very much. There's a real problem with bird life because of changing farming patterns and stuff. So that's gone. Even the word lapwings disappearing from here because you don't see them, so you don't need to use that word. A gun-buddy, a tramp, as we said before, that's kind of gone. Stanky. If you're a bird watcher, you know what a stanky is. Now, if you're a bird watcher, you can tell if that's a moorhen or no, I'm not sure. A tumshay for a turnip, again, we're getting used to neeps now for turnips. When I was a wee boy, everybody made a tumshay lantern at Halloween. Now it's pumpkins. So tumshay is kind of gone. But the guy the other night that used it, he comes from East Lothian, so different area, but still uses that word. And my next slide, please. These are ones that really surprised me. These are marked, and the percentages show this. The group that filled in the questionnaire were really a self-selecting group, people that had bothered to go and do it because they thought it was interesting or worthwhile. So, you know, it's not a scientific survey, but these words were disappearing. Stravaig. Many of you know the word Stravaig. Many of you would use the word Stravaig. Just kind of wandering aimlessly. Maybe it's just folk that like to wander about in the dark. Dwam, I'm away in a dwam, I'm away in a dream. I've said this several times in the supermarket. Check out to somebody, oh, sorry, I was away in a dwam. And they look at you as if you're... Well, that's just in the mornings. Fly for a fright, that's disappearing. Folk don't know somebody gave you a fly. That's just the word I would always use. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's a very abstruse or difficult word. Loup for jump. Again, I think it's maybe just a particular bunch of folk that filled this in, but that seems to be a very common word that folk would understand. Hauk, meaning to dig out. Still got tatty hauking holidays for digging potatoes. And Cockany, my granny used to always shout that at me. Cockany on that bike, whatever I was doing, I would have to Cockany. I've never used that in a classroom, I don't think, but I have used keep the head, which again I got the scathing laughter from the assembled multitudes. It's the same idea, keep the head, get a grip. Some of these are going, so what do we do about it? Do we get them back in? Do we write them down? Do we teach our Waynes these words? McNab, would you like to say something about this? Is McNab's favourite word. When we had a wee chat about this a wee while ago, we talked about things, and this was one of these words that I just use that word without ever thinking. I can see the heads nodding at the back. There was no question in my mind that that was a Scots word and it was a common Scots word. And then I got met by blank stares by lots of people. And then I looked it up, and he interviewed. It's great working with McNabb. You sit and have a wee chat and a cup of coffee. Why don't we just record this? And then the next thing you're away, you're zooming across the other end of the world or somewhere, beamed across the universe. So we had a wee discussion about this particular word. And at that point, what I said to him was, yeah, this is a Scots word, and it seems to be a Kirkcudbright word or a Kirkcudbrightshire word when I looked it up in the dictionary. And the next thing, I went way back and looked it up in the dictionary to check, could I find it? It took me ages to find it again, and it was in an entry that was about a clays hoist, for putting your clays up on the... And that could have been a pulley, but it's also this kind of thing, a stick or something that holds up your washing. So I was really surprised with that. I was very pleased to make your day when I came up with it. So it was a very odd one. Oh, the people of the Galloway Glens, very good. Right. The second part of this was, the second part of the brief was to not just look at the language and see what bits of the language were surviving, which bits weren't. Going back to the very basis of it was really recording people and just letting them talk, letting them explain things about their lives. So there's a record of that somewhere. So we got the interviews from people, and I asked them various questions about various things. As the process went on, I think we got better, because initially I was speaking too much. I wanted it to be like a conversation rather than, what did you do when you were wee, kind of thing. So I think as the thing went on, there was less of me on the tape and more of the other person, which I think was much better. Although some of them, I think, are actually okay when you hear a bit of banter, a bit back and forward, like a conversation, and a bit more natural. We're going to hear one or two bits of people speaking, not quite right, don't worry, he's working well here. I'll tell you when. One of the things that's very noticeable on all of the recordings is that people switch back and forward between Scots and English. And some of these people I knew reasonably well, and I kent they can talk Scots all the time without getting into English at any time, any time. And they kept going back into English all the time. So the dream from McNabb to get this wonderful Galloway Scots all the time, it's not like that. People are people, and what we do with language is it's very flexible. We go in and out. There's one wee bit in one of the tapes where Agnes McQueen talks about her dad on the farm, and she, within about a line and a half of what she said, she uses the word dad, she uses the word father, and the word feather. They all mean the same thing, but she wasn't really making a distinction in any way. She was just flipping in and out of them. People that would talk about the bridge at the Brigadier, and I'll do the same. I mean, what happens, and partly it's because somebody's sitting there recording you, and you know you've got to be, you know, you're trying to put your best forward, I suppose. So that always gets in the way. It's a bit kind of false situation. But it was interesting to hear that happening. But that's what we do all the time. The Ben Garden, Ben Gearden. You're just switching, you're code switching, you're moving back and forward. You would talk to your pals at interval, one way, playtime. You talk to them one way, and then Mrs. MacArthur would ask you a question later on. You'd have to speak that way. So very different situations require different language. So, I'll just read this myself here. When you go back and look at the way people lived here, and the oldest person I spoke to was born 1923, the youngest 1970. So we're not going back terribly far. And yet lots of things have changed. But they might be quite small changes, but in somebody's life they've made a big difference. We're going back to a time people didn't have inside toilets, no running water in the house, no automatic washing machines, no central heating. Most of you lot look like you'll remember this. No central heating, no television, no telephone, no internet. Good grief, how would we survive? No mobile phones. It's very likely they didn't have a car. Folk couldn't afford cars. Just like we're going to struggle to buy electric cars now because they're dear. But they did have a good bus service. And until about the middle of the 60s, they had the railway. And Galloway, Glens, it would be right up that area. So, you know, are we better off, are we worse off? I don't know. One of the things that I found out from Hilda McAdam was about shops in Dalry. She'd been talking about holidays and pointing out people didn't have big fancy holidays abroad. You went to visit relatives, and she described going to Clydebank to visit relatives in Clydebank. The first impression of Glasgow was it was big. I'm sure you remember that yourself from when you were wee. It's not got any weir either. It was the size of it. But then we came back and talked about what Dalry was like. You drive through Dalry, it's a quiet wee place. This is Hilda talking about the shops in Dalry.
The size of it.
That's
I had never realised it was that big. And all the transport and the shops. I mean, there was a lot of shops here then, but nothing like. Because when I was young, there was enough shops in Dalry.
Was there?
Aye. Oh, aye.
Kind of shops like Rapers and.
Well, there was at the bottom of the street, before you went round at the Rochenvar corner, there was a shoemaker.
Right.
Made clogs and things. 3 doors up for that was a fish and chip shop and a cafe.
All right.
And then there was the bottom grocer. And across the road, next to Town Hall, where the police station is now, that was a home bakery.
All right.
And Mr. Jack Rankin and Mrs. Rankin. And then back up the main street, and the power door, 6 doors up for the bottom grocer was a green grocer. And across the road for that was a post office and a wee tea room.
All right.
And the bit that was Wright's Garden Centre at that time was an ironmonger shop, but where the gap is between the hairdressers now and the shop in the house, that was the shop, but it went on fire.
All right.
And it was a terrible fire.
So would you go on to CD or Castle Douglas or the Toon or whatever you would call it, or Dumfries?
Very rarely, because we would get most of the stuff, because there was another grocer's. There was a gents outfitter and a tailor and a ladies' shop.
So we think we're really clever now, but all these things were on
site.
Oh,
aye.
So it'd be good if you could cut me out and just let Hilda talk. The trouble is getting her to stop talking. You think you forgot all the shops in Dalry. There must have been about 90 shops you mentioned, and then she started again with another lot. So obviously, you know, the villages were real hubs. You know, they were well stocked with shops and businesses. My dad said the same about Roanhouse. He grew up in the 1930s in Roanhouse, and blacksmiths, joiners, cobblers, lots and lots of businesses. Lots of these things have gone now, they're just not there. There were also, as well as the shops, there were lots of vans went around to the villages. You got a butcher's van, a baker's van, a fish van. If you wanted something really fancy, you could go, you know, Lipton's van would come. Other vans were available. You could get stuff like ice cream vans came around. 2 or 3 different ice cream vans came around. There were guys came around selling brushes, polish, stuff you would just go online and get now, or go to the supermarket and get. But the vans came round, and it was a big thing in your day. And remember, those were the days when a lot of women would still be you know, housewives working at home, staying at home, looking after the kids. So the vans were a good way to get access to that market for the shops, I suppose, but they were a boon to the people in the villages. I can also remember the library van coming round. You remember that? See, there's all the city folk that have never seen a library van before. See, you folk in the town don't know about this, but if you live in a wee village, the library van comes every fortnight and you get to go into the library van and choose your books and you've got them for a fortnight. I think that's now gone. So that's a very recent thing. When I went online to find out if the library vans still go, it looks like they were on the way out before COVID. And then after COVID, it looks like a lot of them haven't been brought back on, which is a real problem, you know, for older folk, for folk that are not as mobile, can't get into town, don't have a car. And folk do still use libraries, despite the fact the governments are trying to shut them down. They'll edit that bit out lately. Used to be a chip van went round in the 1970s. Ian Murray had a chip van that went round. Now there's a pizza wagon goes round. So tastes change and all of these things. One of the other things folk talked about was how cold it was. This is before global warming, I suppose. Oh, it was Carl, said John Cubby from New Galloway. Oh, it was Carl. Oh, it was right, Carl. And he went on to describe how Carl it was in great long sentences. He was great. And he was talking about the frost on the inside of the windows and all that stuff. I still get that. I told the Waynes about it at school and they're all looking at me and saying, what's he talking about? Because central heating's done away with all of that. He also talked with great vigour about the Bathnacht. Bathnacht. None of this modern showering every day nonsense. Probably wasn't running water in the house, or certainly nothing to heat the water, so it was kettles in the bath in front of the fire, and it would be one night a week. Some folk talked about the sitting on the draining board, getting a good scrub in the sink, when they were quite wee, I think, but just, you know, that's all happened in the last sort of, I don't know, 30, 40 years, that's all changed. So although some of us are old enough to remember that, others are a bit younger. Outside toilets were a big topic of conversation. Cubby told a story about his mum shouting at him when he was a wee boy, here, come here. Well, look, and it had been snowing, and she said, there's only one set of footprints going down to that toilet. Huh? Well, that woman next door went down there yesterday, or you know, a wee while ago, and there's no footprints coming back. So I'll wait and see what happened to her. So he wasn't very impressed with that notion. However, he went, being a good wee boy, he went and he discovered that she'd got locked in because the lock had frozen. Probably not a great place to be. So he had to go back up and they had to boil water up in a pan and take it out and unfreeze the lock to get this poor old woman out of the lavatory. So he told me that story. Somebody else told me a story about how as wee boys, they would watch for somebody to go to the outside toilet. They were generally up the garden a bit. Then they would get some stones and rattle the roof. See, they made their own entertainment in those days. That's how it goes. The other thing my dad talked about in schools, he talked about the evacuees coming in 1939 from Glasgow. And he talked about, we couldn't understand them, we didn't know what they were talking about. They came from Govan and Chucher Hill and all these bits, we didn't know what they were going on about. And the thing that stood out about them was that they had Superman jerseys. And my dad had never seen this before. It's a cultural centre, Roundhouse, you know. He'd never seen a Superman jersey before. It was right enough. you didn't see these things. It wasn't, kind of after the war, you get the American comics and stuff coming here, but before that, didn't get them. So he talks about that, and he talks about one guy who was really difficult to follow, and he had a hard time kind of settling in when he came here. And he said he kept running away from school, and they called him the wild man, which probably wasn't very politically correct, but he said you could see him, he would get out of the school and run, and you could see him crossing dikes and crossing fields and getting further and further away, you know, like somebody in a cartoon, and then there'd be 2 or 3 boys who'd be sent to bring him back to the school. And the way he describes it, he's half laughing about it, it's quite funny, but think about where we are now, think about the world we're living in now, think about migrants, think about refugees, think about how frightened that wee guy must have been as he took off. Where was he going? Was he going to run back to Glasgow? What was going on? So it's strange how these things come back around again. And again, it's that thing about we're living in a wee quiet place, but everything reverberates outwards from this place and back into this place. So most folk I talk to seem to have enjoyed being at school. And this is probably because, as Anne Howie, who grew up in a farm near Ringford, pointed out, school's where you met your pals, because your pals stayed miles away if you were on a farm. So what you did when you were away from school was you played with your sisters and brothers, or you were made to work. A lot of work to do in the farm. Agnes McQueen talks about walking 4 miles a day from High Banks to Kirkcudbright for school. Why isn't doing that now? The belt was used to help children learn. This is good for you. It will help you remember your spelling. Hold out your hand. And that wasn't stopped until 1987. Not that long ago. Hilda remembers the good old days when teachers were very adept at throwing these wooden back blackboard dusters. I never had one of them. I could hit Kenny Glendive for here. You got very good at that. Some of them got very good at that kind of thing. But it was all done in the interests of helping enthuse young people with learning. I'm sure it was a great success as they sat there seething at this. People remembered lessons in science and cooking and sums. Nobody mentioned maths, it was always sums, PE or drill. Physical exercise sounds pretty bad, but drill sounds decidedly dodgy. Teachers were recalled, some of them very fondly, others not quite so fondly. Kate Kay, who's now a teacher herself, she waxed lyrical about the shoes one of her teachers wore. She was fair excited talking about it all these years later. I'm sure she could see them in her mind's eye. She talked about it. And while we're smiling at that, think back to your own teachers. Think about how much you remember about what they taught you and how much you remember about their dress sense. My daughter used to check me out every morning before I went to work. 6 years old, she's looking at me and saying, "Are you wearing those shoes with those trousers?" So I'll be back and change. And then when the happiest days of your life were over, and in those days generally 13, maybe 15, you were out in the big bad world of work. Lots of opportunities now for people, but not so much back in the day, as they say. When Agnes McQueen left school, she said she was more or less expected to work on the farm for nothing. That's her words, for nothing. Oh, you used to work on the farm for nothing. So for quite a while she worked on the farm for nothing. Well, obviously her mum and dad fed her, but that, you know, that was about it. She did find work eventually with a local vet, so she ended up moving there, and she was a sort of housekeeper and answered the phone. So she had to learn to use the phone. She had to learn how to speak to the kind of posh people in those days that could afford to have a vet, and farmers and landowners and folk. So she learned a lot of new social skills just from being in that situation. Otherwise, she'd be expected just to work on the farm doing very, very basic things. And that's when she would be using the very basic words that describe life on a farm. And you can guess what they are, no doubt. And then one of the things that Anne Howie said was, before we got all the mechanisation on the land, there was a very definite sense of what happened at each time of the year. It sounds kind of like Ecclesiastes here. There was a time for lambing, a time for clipping. This is me, no Anne. There was a time for lambing, a time for clipping, a time for the hay and for the harvest. We still have school holidays, October, for Tatty Howkin, although I don't think many folk would actually go Tatty Howkin nowadays. Tommy Thompson, farmer near Roanhouse, describes the threshing machine coming. He thinks I can read that for here. I've got a clock up here. He described the threshing machine coming, and it's like a scene from Tess of the D'Urberville. These folk getting the stooks and throwing them into the machine and doing whatever they had to do. It's like a scene from the 19th century. I remember walking past that machine when I was a wee boy, that very machine, and I didn't know what was going on in it. It just looked like this thing the size of a house, and all these folk were throwing things at it. It was very odd. So it was hard work, but a lot of people helped on farms. You know, villagers. I struggled with that bit because I was going to call them the village people at one point, but I thought I'll better not do that. Villagers would be out there helping with the hay, helping with the harvest, helping with picking tatties, showing turnips, various things. After their normal work, they would go and do this of an evening. I can remember whole fields of folk from the village doing this. It was like a medieval scene almost, although there'd be a tractor and a binder or something. Sometimes they would get bags of tatties and carrots and things. They wouldn't have been paid, they would get bags of food to help them through the winter. David Wallace up at Sheila Castle Maddie farm, he came up with much the same as Anne. He came out with this same idea of the year split into these parts. And then once he'd told me about lambing and clipping and all this stuff, he then went back and changed the order. So he started November the year before when the tops are put out. So the whole thing was a different cycle for him. And he remembered that. He was, I'm not sure what age Davy is, but he was one of the older folk that I talked to, but he remembered that very clearly. He remembered working up on the hills, working on the farms. And now that he sits in his house in Kirkcudbright, he looks out onto the Rins and he can still think about that while he's not actually doing it. We'll come back to Davy in a minute. We've got a clip of, we've got Cubby and the dentist. Sorry, I'm going to backtrack slightly. This is about school life where you discover that things can go wrong and there's health issues.
Folk are awfully prone to ailments. You can calls, bugs, chicken pox. You're in a close proximity. And then you get the net nurse used to come around and check your hair to see.
Oh, they're still on the go.
Oh, crikey. Oh, they were well and truly here for a good month anyway, hoping he'd. Aye. And the biggest fear, I'll tell you, ever at the scale here was when Miss Miller was our skilled dentist. Now, she had an old grey caravan that used to come in and reverse into the side, and when he seen that electric cable coming out the window, he thought, here's a blooming electric chair getting plugged in, and it was the electric chair. She was ex-army.
All right.
The anaesthetic. If you had a rotten tooth and she thought it was to come out, bing, it was out before he kent where you were. You hadn't time to greet. You ken, you were that big a shock. Oh, it's petrifying.
I can mind her coming, but I can't mind all the details of it.
Oh, Miss Miller, oh, she was a big woman. Ken, she stepped, when you were sitting kind of semi-tied into the chair, she would come into the caravan and you could feel her getting a bit launched to the side as she got on, ken. Oh, a big kind of like a sergeant, you know, she marched everywhere and she'd got a big blue gown on. Oh, crikey.
He talks about getting a lips to the side, whether he's talking about her or the caravan. I'm going to have to speed up a wee bit to finish off here. Other kind of things that folk did, games folk played and things like that. We've got a wee clip of Kay describing playing at wee hooses. I'm sure lots of us played at building wee dens and wee hooses and stuff. So
there was bushes at the primary school, and you played wee hooses in them, John, but they weren't just bushes that you could get inside. We used branches off them to sweep the flare, and we had one of them had a back lobby in it and a bedroom. You know, and
so was this just the lasses, or were the boys doing this?
No, the boys weren't doing it. They were too busy fighting.
can you imagine the boys building some kind of den with a back lobby? Honestly, that's crazy. I'm going to jump ahead quite a wee bit here, but I've got another wee clip I want to play. It's Hilda talking about the dances. You got that?
Before I moved to Underhill, where I was born, I just remember parents and everything come out at night and played kick the can and rounders and and things like that. The parents joined in. But there was plenty of entertainment. There was dances. I mean, there was a dance somewhere nearly every weekend, and a lot of concerts at that time.
Right.
Just actual concerts.
What kind of concerts?
Well, just different musicians and singers, and we used to get some good choirs coming. And
so did these folk come from other places, or would be locals?
No, they're locals stay
joining in.
The Riot had their Starry Nights band, which my dad played in. He was the drummer, and there's a lot of dances with them. But I mean, round about in the area of the Rhino, there was nearly a dance in one of the places every weekend.
And would you go into different bits?
Aye, when we were old enough.
How would you travel to
the
bus again?
There's not many buses that going up to there where they were at that time of night, but folk would give you a lift. I went in the motorbike because
You're the second year I've talked to. A fella in Kirkcudbright used to go on his motorbike to the dancing or to see his girlfriend over the hill in Cumnock. He used to go over that with the motorbike. So was that a common thing?
That wasn't David Wallace, was it?
It was David Wallace. I'm being confidential here. But no, David said he went on the bike.
George, I had Kent George all my life, and it just...
The fella's name just to keep it nice and cool.
You were on the motorbike.
So obviously there's a kind of gang of them up there that were marauding the place, going to dances and motorbikes. We thought Teddy Boys were a sort of fairly modern phenomenon. Dances were really common. Scottish country dance band music was the thing. After a while that changed, and I think we've got a wee clip of Agnes. The sound's not so great here, but she was describing they used to do eights and reels and quadrilles and Highland Scottishes and stuff, and then.
No, we cycled. Oh, but there's dances, proper dances, of course. No, this. I didn't know what you caught what they do.
But they're happy. And was the
saying
dances
what
like
they
in
used
the
to
wee
do
halls,
in these
like
Highland
Yes.
parties and stuff, and they just, I didn't ken what it is they're doing now. So, you know, times have changed. Cubby talked about going to the dances and CD. That been my kind of day as well. A lot of rock music then, hard rock music. And then he said I had to learn this new word. What was it? Discotheque. We all had to learn that word. Now you have to explain it to your Waynes. And you have to explain to them what a record is, you know, and all this stuff. So it's all been, a lot of changes have happened there. We're just about on time, so I'll have to wrap it up with two wee bits I'd like to play you. Two very different clips that might suggest some of the voices and subject matter in the recording. First, Andy Campbell talking about a wee memory shared just as I was about to press the stop button, and he's thinking about his primary school days. He can still mind them just, and a sight that he saw.
We stood on the top flare at the Castledite school, and he could see. I always remember the teacher saying, "Watch that boat sailing through the fields." You couldn't see the water, but you could see the boat as it passed the All Corinthians pitch and such like.
So blessings on that primary teacher for giving that wee boy a moment of wonder. Aye, can mind the name of it. Just a wonderful thing for him to remember, and he still remembers it. And I'd like to finish just playing a wee bit of Davy Wallace, sitting in his house in Kirkcudbright, remembering the farms that he used to work on or was connected with. And you can almost hear him conjuring them up. And I think the humanity in his voice as he's doing that is very striking. He did this twice in the interview, or in through this same wee litany of voices.
There were a lot of farms. There was a Shield, there was Cosmody, Dunall, Forest, Forbush, Backbush, Furnason.
It's just that litany of the names of the farms, and I have every faith that they're in order, and he's remembering it. I just love that. So thank you, Davy, and thank you. Well, now there's a test.
No, how do you follow that? Thank you so much for that, John. We have a couple of questions online. Was it Stuart Patterson's new book of poems that you mentioned? Does that sound right?
Say that again?
Was it Stuart Patterson's book of poems that you mentioned? Just as you
No, it was Raymond Ross.
Good plug for Stuart Patterson's new book of poems there, then, nonetheless.
Stuart's just got a wee Scots book out.
Just before we open up for any questions in the room, another question online about education, which I know is a topic close to your heart, but do you feel have they got it right now?
They haven't got it right, but they've got it better, and that the intention's there. And various documents that have come out from...
I'm going to stand closer to you.
Various... beginning to feel like Morecambe and Wise here. Cheech and Chong. I think they're getting closer, but there's still a long, long way to go. I did a thing years ago in service for teachers. I mean, I'm going back 20 years maybe, and a lot of the resistance to working with Scots stuff was coming from some of the teachers, not just from the pupils and parents. There's quite a lot of work now trying to involve parents in this. One wee thing I should maybe say, when I got the things back from the questionnaires, there were quite a lot of comments from people that had moved into the area, and they were very interested in this, and they were interested in the language and the differences. And I really appreciated that, because it implies a kind of inclusivity, which, you know, a few years back it would have been, oh, you didn't talk like us, we're not speaking to you. Kind of like my dad had to learn with evacuees. You have to learn other people's languages and interact and engage. Actually, my dad had a friend there. He made a friend with one of the evacuees, and he ended up visiting them in America quite a few times. So, you know, things do change.
Has anyone got a question in the room for John? Any words that weren't mentioned that should have been, or any other points that have come out of anything that John said?
A different, sorry, that's a question about Ulster Scots, which has a quite official status in Northern Ireland. How hard is it to read it or speak it or hear it? The accent's different, so that might, as well as not seeing it written down, you know, the accent's different, so that might have made a difference as well. Aye, but we have to make that wee bit of effort, obviously, but it's good that the language is accepted like that. One of the most embarrassing things is when you see politicians kidding on they can talk Scots. It just causes a few issues.
Oh yeah, yeah. Just that I've noticed in the area people calling their grandpas Papa. Quite a few people locally call their grandpas Papa, and I've heard from other people further away that that's not actually that common. That it's a kind of local thing.
I don't know. People say it's like there was a big row in the telly yesterday about grandma as a word for grannies or grandmothers, and I think the Papa, Grandpa, grandfather thing, it's dependent on families really. Some folk call their dad Papa or Papa. So I don't know. I don't know why that's changed.
Are there any other questions in the room for John? Oh, I can come in here, Ian.
No, not a question, an observation of the difference between a boy for Palmarky and a boy for your own house. And the pair of you standing up there, you would think you were from different worlds.
Well, we are.
I think that's the most flattering thing anyone said to John for a long time. Yeah, so that's very good. Any other questions in the room? I'll come back in the back. Yes.
Is any of all this available in print, John, that we can actually read?
That's the man to ask, because this stuff will all be archived. So the thing that I've been reading from needs a final tidy, and that will be, I hope, archived by Galloway Glens with more audio clips inserted as links you can click on. That's the plan.
Yep. Yeah, and we're also going to put the audio clips on as well. So there's a new website called www.glenkenscott, and it's quite good as a repository of all the information for lots of different Galloway Glens projects. And we're going to be able to put a page on there which is going to have the full report. And also, this is actually being recorded, we should have mentioned, for YouTube as well. So we'll have the recording of John's presentation in all its glory. Any other questions in the room? Probably got time for one more question. I'm sorry, I will come to you just for the people at home to hear the full experience.
Yeah, hi John. I just wanted to know, I know you said it wasn't a scientific study, but what's the general health then of how the language of Galloway? Is it in good order, or is it dying?
It's been dying for hundreds of years, but it's still here. That's the thing. It seems to be that if you scratch the surface just a wee bit, folk will talk to you in Scots quite happy. It is changing though. I mean, again, it's been dying for all this time for various reasons, and it's survived. But one of the big changes is the internet and English now being the language of the internet. And English also being the language of any voice-activated systems. I'm sure you've spent many a happy half hour trying to speak to some blasted machine that doesn't recognise Scottish accents or Scots words. And if you're texting or if you're writing anything, it goes daft if there's Scots words, changes, and you've got to be on your guard the whole time for that. But I think basically it's pretty healthy. As healthy as any other language. I mean, there are lots of minority languages around the place. There are lots of activists in this field. If you go online, one of the things about the Scots being written down, it's not been written down in a regular spelling scheme for a long, long time. I don't think it ever had a proper agreed spelling scheme. If you write to the Herald, if you write to one of the newspapers and suggest this is how it should look, this is how you should spell it, you're opening up a bee's bite, basically. It's you get all this stuff coming at you. And a lot of the ideas are really good, and a lot of the versions people put up, this is how to spell it, they would work, and they work fine if you're in Falkirk, if you're in Punaki, if you're in Aberdeen, then you know, folk in Aberdeen are a different breed as well. You would have to agree on a spelling system that would work through the whole country, and that's just really difficult. But the more it's out of print or not written down, I think that'll be a bit harder. But wander around Kirkcudbright, wander around Olbeatty, you know, you'll hear it. Although I found Stuart is quite strong, I think. I don't know about the other place over that way. Taught in Dumfries for a long time, and if somebody asked me questions, and if I used a word like nicht, or I said, what time's that happened at 8 o'clock? They really thought that was weird. So I seem to have a slightly older version of this than some people nowadays. But words like nicht and brecht are just the normal words to me. That pronunciation is the one that I would use. There's no reason why it can't be written down sort of half and half. Burns didn't write in Scots all the time. He didn't spell all the words as he would say them. There are a lot of words in Burns where he'll say nicht or brecht, but it'll be written as night or bride. But you can change it, and we're very good at that, Scots. We're very good at switching. Sometimes I sit and listen to the news and translate it into Scots in my head to see whether it can be done, to see how it would sound.
I wonder if the world makes any more sense, John, when you do that.
Not a lot, not a lot.
Brilliant. I'm conscious of everyone's evening. Thank you so much. Can we do one more round of applause quickly for John for his time today? Brilliant. Thank you so much to everyone here tonight. Thanks so much to everyone watching from home. The event has been recorded and will be on our YouTube channel. And as John says, the most important thing is the report that John's written. The audio clips are going to be pulled together onto a webpage of the glenkens.scot website. So on behalf of everyone at Galloway Glens and everyone here tonight, thank you very much for coming on tonight. Thank you.